The walls don't echo here. They absorb. Stone that once bore the weight of kings now bears witness to the collapse of one. He lies on a blanket so thin it clings to his bones like parchment. The cold doesn't leave. It lives here, curling into the hollow between his ribs where warmth used to be. There is no window, only a slit that lets in a line of gray, a wound in the wall that bleeds light without mercy. His eyes are sunken, not from sleep, but from watching time forget him. They bring food sometimes. Broth, always cold, always just enough to keep him breathing, never enough to keep him alive. It arrives in silence and leaves with silence. No one speaks to him, not even the rats. His fingernails are cracked, his lips split. His thoughts drift toward perfume, the way it once clung to her, the way it filled his court, masking the rot of false loyalty. Now, all that's left is the smell of stone, of mildew, of dying teeth. He does not scream. There is no one to hear. And even if there were, kings do not beg. He listens instead, to his breath, to the groan of hunger, to the whisper of footsteps that always walk past. The room has no voice, and still it rules him. They dressed him in velvet, though the boy had asked for wool. The garments itched. The collar bit at his neck. He stood too still for a child, too quiet for a prince. Outside, the bells of Westminster rang with forced joy, but inside the abbey, the walls sagged with dread. The candlelight flickered on the faces of old men who had already begun carving up the future. His uncle stood beside him, lips folded into a smile that never reached the eyes. A smile too practiced, too patient, the kind that waits for weakness. He was 10. His shoes didn't touch the floor when he sat. His hands were too small to hold the scepter, so they gave him a smaller one, fashioned for ceremony, not power. And then came the crown, gold, cold, eternal. They lowered it slowly, as if it were sacred, but when it touched his scalp, it tilted, slid to the side. It was too large. It dipped over one eye. He didn't flinch. He let it hang, crooked, like a question no one dared to answer. They called him Richard of Bordeaux, son of the Black Prince. But his father was already fading, not in memory, but in flesh. The great warrior, who once trampled kings beneath his banner, had died unceremoniously, shivering and voiding into a basin, the fire drained from his body by something unseen and unrelenting. No swords, no armies, just a slow undoing. The boy had watched. He had listened to the coughing, the groaning, the muttered apologies spoken to ghosts. And when it ended, no one wept in front of him. They only nodded and moved on, like it was a ledger finally balanced. The throne waited. They took him from his mother's arms and placed him on the coronation chair as if he were a relic. And maybe he was. A symbol, not a boy. A name, not a soul. The archbishop anointed him with oil that trickled down his temples like sweat, and for a moment he imagined it was tears. Not his, someone else's. Maybe the old god they kept invoking with hollow mouths. He couldn't read all the words they spoke that day, but he remembered the pressure. Not just the crown, but the way the eyes of the court pressed against his skin like fingers, watching, measuring, waiting for the cracks. His uncle, John of Gaunt, stood behind the throne like a shadow stitched into marble. When the prayers ended, the nobles knelt. But they did not kneel to him. They knelt to a vacancy, a pause between kings, a weakness waiting to be corrected. He missed his brother then, the one who should have worn the crown. Edward, the firstborn, the bright one, dead at 5 of some fever that turned his cheeks red and then blue. Richard had loved him with a love too big for words, the way only younger brothers do. When Edward died, they didn't let Richard see the body, but he remembers the door closing, the silence afterward, and the way everyone started looking at him differently, not with pity, but with expectation. He wanted to be a knight, not a king. He wanted horses, not courtiers. He wanted to laugh without it being a statement of policy. But the crown doesn't ask what you want, it chooses. And once it rests on your head, even crooked, it begins to grow roots, not into the skull, but into the spine. You straighten, you freeze, you forget how to run. The months after the coronation blurred like ink on wet parchment. He was never alone. Tutors recited lines he could not remember. Priests warned him of devils that looked like allies. His food was tasted before he touched it. His toys vanished one by one, replaced with seals and scrolls and the scent of ink. At night, he slept with the windows closed, not from cold, but from fear. Somewhere in the halls, footsteps would always echo long after the candles were out, and sometimes, in the dark, he imagined his father's armor walking without a body, heavy, creaking, searching for someone strong enough to fill it. John of Gaunt visited often, always with gifts, always with a sermon disguised as advice. "A king must not bend," he would say, handing Richard a golden dagger. "He must shape the world, or be shaped by it." Richard would nod, but inside he wondered, if I never asked to be shaped, does that make me the clay or the sculptor? The nobles called him gentle, too gentle. They said it with smiles and sharpened glances. He tried to mimic strength, speaking deeper, walking slower, refusing to cry when the servants whispered his mother's name behind doors. But gentleness, once smelled, cannot be unsmelled. They sensed it like wolves scent blood beneath fresh snow. One morning, he stood alone in the coronation chamber. The chair was empty. The crown rested on a cushion, glinting. He walked up to it and stared. It was not beautiful. It was not magical. It was a trap, a perfect golden trap. He reached out, lifted it carefully, and placed it back on his head. It still slipped over his eye. The court was a garden of glass, and Richard walked through it like a man enchanted by his own reflection. The walls gleamed with polished surfaces, silver trays, polished shields, gilt-framed mirrors that stared back with unblinking loyalty. He did not ask for truth. He asked for symmetry. His hair arranged just so, his robes a cascade of crimson and gold, his voice, low and practiced, filling the halls like incense. "The Lord's anointed," they whispered as he passed, and he believed them, not because it was true, but because it was repeated. He spent hours alone in the throne room, studying his reflection in the blade of a ceremonial sword. When it fogged from his breath, he would draw circles in it with his finger, like a boy tracing halos on glass. Around him, the courtiers bowed so often their spines curved into permanent shapes. They spoke in compliments braided like nooses, and he wore them proudly. "Majesty," they said, "radiance, vision incarnate." He never asked what they said when the doors closed. He did not want to know. Behind curtains, the old lords whispered like rats, quick, soft, and fatal. They spoke of taxes that bled the commons dry, of lands given to favorites whose fingers had never gripped a sword hilt, of poets elevated to generals, of boys with painted nails who wielded power with the flick of a phrase. Richard did not hear, or rather he chose not to. The echoes he answered came only from mirrors, and mirrors do not argue. When a noble protested, Richard smiled and summoned another feast. Silk banners, roasted swans, dancers with golden veils. He believed beauty could drown discontent, that music could suffocate truth. He turned the court into a theater, each banquet a rehearsal for the lie he needed most, that all was well, that loyalty could be choreographed. He changed the ceremonies, bent ancient customs to suit his moods. When one bishop refused to kneel the extra inch Richard demanded, the man found himself preaching in a village chapel within a week. The message spread fast. Bend or break. The altar was no longer sacred. Only the mirror mattered. And still, the courtiers smiled. They came draped in brocade and falsehoods. They studied his expressions like scripture, adjusting their tone to match his hunger for praise. One day, he proclaimed himself chosen by God, not metaphorically, not ceremonially, but literally divine. No one laughed, not even the priest. Instead, they clapped. They called it revelation. They asked if they might kiss the hem of his robe. In private, they sharpened their daggers with prayer. He replaced counselors with poets, generals with flatterers, men of war with men of words. They sang him to sleep with odes to his wisdom. He called it vision. They called it survival. In the mirror hall, treason dressed itself in compliments and no one noticed. When his cousin Henry sent letters from exile, Richard had them read aloud, then burned. He laughed. "He writes like a man desperate to return," he said. "Let him stay in the dark. England has no room for shadows." But he did not see that the shadows were already here. They had voices, and titles, and seats at his table. Some nights he wandered the gallery alone. Dozens of mirrors faced one another in a silent war of reflections. He stood between them, multiplying endlessly, watching himself watch himself. He would raise a hand and see 100 kings raise theirs. Sometimes he whispered to them. Sometimes they whispered back. "Do they love me?" he once asked aloud, gazing into a mirror so old the silver had begun to flake. The face that stared back did not answer. But Richard smiled anyway, because it didn't say no. One morning, the chamberlain found him asleep in the throne room, head resting against a polished shield. He had scrawled something into the dust with his finger. "Am I still seen?" No one dared erase it, but no one answered either. She arrived in winter, cloaked in frost and language he did not yet understand. Anne of Bohemia. Her hands were warm, her eyes steadier than his courtiers, her silence fuller than their praise. She never bowed. She never clapped when he entered. She merely looked, as though she were measuring not his crown, but the weight he carried beneath it. At first, they called her foreign, dull, plain, but she spoke softly to the servants and remembered their names. She rode without guards and sang without music. She asked Richard what frightened him, and when he didn't answer, she waited. Not for the words, but for the quiet to tell the truth. He learned to breathe in her presence, to blink without thinking of how it looked. She corrected him without shame, touched his arm when his voice trembled, told him he had spoken too harshly. "You are not your anger," she once said, after a night when he had sent 3 knights into exile for interrupting him, "and they are not your mirrors." They walked gardens together, ones he had forgotten even existed. She showed him moss on stone, the way ivy could choke or cradle depending on how it was trained. He laughed around her, but not the performer's laugh, the small, cracked laugh of someone uncoiling. "With you," he once whispered, "the court disappears." She kissed his temple and said nothing. When his temper flared, she did not flinch. When he doubted himself, she did not reassure, she reminded. "They serve the crown," she said, "not the boy beneath it. But I see both." He began to believe it. He began to sleep through the night. But the peace was borrowed, and grief is punctual. She took ill in summer. Fever that climbed like ivy, burning through her veins, turning her skin the color of paper ash. Physicians gathered like birds, whispering behind the curtains. Richard stayed at her side. For 2 days, he did not eat. For 3, he did not speak. When she stopped breathing, he kissed her lips, still warm, and whispered a secret no one else ever heard. The room where she died. He ordered it razed. Not cleared, not sealed, destroyed. Floorboards torn up, tapestries burned, windows smashed. She cannot haunt what no longer stands, he said. The servants crossed themselves, but they still heard footsteps at night, where the room used to be. He stopped wearing color. He wore his grief like armor, heavy, gleaming, brittle. He built shrines of silence. He forbade the court from speaking her name for a year, but whispered it to himself between dreams. Anne, Anne, Anne. Like a compass spinning in a dead storm, he began to drift. The mirrors returned. So did the feasts. But now he didn't look at himself. He looked at the empty chair beside him. Her ring stayed on his finger. Even as his hands thinned, even as his touch grew colder. When foreign dignitaries came, he introduced no queen. She walks elsewhere, he would say, pointing to the garden she once loved. No one dared correct him. The court grew darker, so did his eyes. Without Anne, his fury lost its shape. It became smoke, directionless, suffocating. He began banishing people for glancing too long, for speaking too fast, for laughing when he was not. His favorites fed him flattery, but it all tasted like dust. His enemies multiplied in corners. He asked his scribes to translate her letters, though he had already read them 100 times. "Maybe I missed something," he said. "Maybe she told me what comes next." But the pages were still, and the ink had dried. He built her a tomb, marble and gold, taller than any king's. But when it was done, he didn't visit. He claimed it was too grand, too loud. She was simple, he said. This lies. The tomb remained untouched for years. Flowers wilted at its steps. So did memory. In private, he took to walking the corridors she once crossed barefoot. He counted the stones. He traced the lintels. He said her name under his breath as if repeating it could summon her or erase what followed. But no one came. Only the echoes. And even they had begun to forget her voice. They brought her across the channel in a ship that smelled of roses and salt. Isabella of Valois. 6 years old, with ribbons in her hair and a doll clasped to her chest. She curtsied as they taught her, but her knees shook. Richard took her hand and smiled, but it was the smile of a man gazing into a painting, not a person. The courtiers clapped. The bells rang. But behind closed doors the air congealed into whispers. He called her Little Dove. She called him Majesty, and meant it. At court, she sat beside him in silks too heavy for her spine. She dangled her legs from the throne steps while Richard issued edicts dressed in mourning black. He did not kiss her, he did not touch her, but he stared at her as though she might one day become someone else, someone older, someone who could hold him the way Anne once had. But dolls don't grow. They just crack. The marriage was written in ink, not in flesh. A treaty masked as a wedding, sealed with songs no one dared sing too loudly. England would have peace with France, and Richard would have a queen who could not yet spell her own name. He gave her palaces filled with mirrors, but she played with paper birds. He gave her a diadem that slid down over her ears. She laughed. He winced. There was no heir. There would not be. The cradle in the royal nursery remained covered in silk, untouched. Courtiers walked past it in silence, as though afraid sound might awaken a child that did not exist. Richard passed it sometimes and stared at it for minutes, unmoving. Once, a maid found him with his hand resting gently on the empty mattress, whispering words in a tongue she didn't recognize. When she returned, he was gone. The people looked away. They muttered prayers in taverns and spat near statues. A king without an heir was a book with no last page. The nobles held meetings behind draped windows. They drew up family trees with shaking hands. Blood was being measured. Claims were being weighed. Richard saw none of it, or pretended not to. He hosted feasts where Isabella sat on a raised cushion to reach the table. She drank watered wine and giggled at riddles she didn't understand. When foreign ambassadors praised her beauty, Richard beamed. "She will be the mother of peace," he said, "but peace does not grow in wombs that have not yet bled." In council, the old lords spoke in lowered tones. They asked about succession not with accusation but with dread. Richard silenced them with a glance sharp enough to draw blood. "There is time," he said. "God provides." But even God cannot ripen winter fruit. At night, Isabella's rooms glowed with candlelight and nursery songs. Richard stood outside the door, listening to her lullabies. He never entered. He never knocked. Just stood, as if waiting for something divine to happen, as if time might collapse and rebuild itself into the shape of a family. He began sleeping in the royal library, surrounded by books about empire and dynasty, scrolls, lineages, treaties long expired. One servant found him curled in a chair with a parchment crumpled in his hand, a family tree with his name at the top and a blank line beneath. Empty, expectant, eternal. The cradle remained untouched, covered in dust now, the silk yellowing, the wood beginning to splinter. No child would ever cry there. No lullaby would echo. It sat beneath a stained glass window of the Virgin and Child, where light passed through blue robes and fell on the void below. A promise unfulfilled. And the throne, that massive, ancient chair, carved from oak and crowned with lions, began to look less like a seat and more like a box, long, heavy, waiting. They came wearing lace and laughter, their voices as smooth as honey poured over poison. Boys with manicured nails and knives tucked behind their tongues. Richard welcomed them like a drowning man embraces driftwood, not because it would save him, but because it floated. Their hands were soft. Their mouths knew only praise, and their eyes gleamed with the hunger of those born just outside the walls, now feasting within them. He gave them titles that once belonged to men who bled. Lands carved from the estates of warriors, castles passed like wine cups. One was made earl for composing a poem. Another became chancellor for guessing Richard's mood before he spoke. The old lords watched from the periphery, silent and stiff, like statues commemorating a time already forgotten. They bowed, but their knuckles whitened. The favorites wore perfume thick enough to disguise rot. They danced through halls their fathers had never entered, sneering at coats of arms they could not read. One by one, they replaced the men who had fought beside Richard's ancestors, replacing iron with silk, sword with smile. Their laughter became policy, their gossip, law. At banquets, Richard sat flanked by these gilded ornaments. They toasted to his wisdom, his divinity, his eternal youth. He drank deeply. He believed. Outside, the nobles whispered behind tapestries, drawing maps in candlelight, tracing bloodlines like escape routes. Inside, the court glowed like a jewel, brilliant but cracked. He ignored petitions from seasoned knights. He dismissed the grievances of dukes as jealousy. "They envy my vision," he said, brushing aside a general who had served 3 monarchs. "They are relics, I am the dawn." The old guard bent their knees but sharpened their pens. Treason doesn't begin with a sword. It begins with silence. The favorites plotted with laughter. They divided titles like loaves, passed appointments between themselves like gifts at a masquerade. One morning, a bishop arrived to find his cathedral given away to a boy who could not read scripture. When he protested, he was escorted out by guards who bowed while removing him. Richard didn't notice, or didn't care. His throne had become a stage, and he the star of a play where no one dared improvise. Disagreement was rewritten as blasphemy. Concern became conspiracy. The court no longer advised, it applauded. One of the new lords wore a chain heavier than his spine could bear. He walked with a stoop, but never removed it. "The king gave it to me," he said. "Let it break me." The old nobles watched the dance from the shadows, faces stiff beneath powdered wigs. They remembered wars, they remembered loyalty, but they also remembered how quickly crowns change heads. They began to meet in private, small gatherings, no toasts, no songs, just ink, blood, and the quiet sound of decisions hardening into fate. One night, Richard hosted a feast. Peacock roasted in gold leaf, wine from Venetian barrels. His favorites wore masks shaped like lions. A toast was raised. To the king, who needs no army, for his words alone conquer hearts. Outside, a messenger arrived, a letter from the north, rumors of unrest. Richard waved it away and called for more music, but in the flicker of the candles a noble turned his gaze toward a mirror, and in it he did not see a king, only a boy, surrounded by velvet and vultures, and every one of them smiled with teeth too white, too sharp, too many. He watched from across the sea, eyes like flint, hands steady as parchment curled beneath royal wax. Henry Bolingbroke, cousin, noble, son of the old guard, shadow of a crown he never asked for but never forgot. When they exiled him, he did not protest. When Richard stripped him of lands that had belonged to his father, he did not shout. He simply wrote letters. He studied maps. He listened. Silence, when filled with intent, becomes a blade, and Henry sharpened his in exile, waiting not for weakness, but for arrogance. They had once walked the same halls, Richard and Henry, cousins in name, strangers in blood. One draped in silks, dreaming of mirrored perfection. The other tempered by war, his hands scarred from reins and steel. While Richard polished his court with poets, Henry led men through mud, through siege, through cold. One ruled, one earned. When John of Gaunt, Henry's father, died, the law was clear. The Duchy of Lancaster, vast and ancient, should pass to the son. But Richard, perched on a throne he could no longer feel, seized it for himself. He signed the decree with ink that bled like betrayal. The nobles stirred. Henry said nothing. He didn't need to. Because inheritance is not just land. It is memory. It is blood. And Richard had touched the one thing that could not be touched without consequence. Henry's silence cracked when the wind shifted. He watched Richard sail to Ireland, chasing shadows, dragging half his strength across the sea. The throne, left breathing but unwatched, began to call, not with voice but with vacancy. And Henry answered. He landed not with drums, but with dust. A small force, a legal claim, not a rebellion, a restoration. He came not to conquer, but to correct, or so he said, and the lords believed him, because correction feels cleaner than coup. They came to him in twos and threes, dukes, barons, men who had swallowed pride for years and were now choking on it. Henry didn't raise banners. They were raised for him. They whispered in castles, rode by moonlight, opened gates in silence. The north bowed first, then the west, then the very air around London began to still. He did not mention revenge. He mentioned justice. He did not raise his voice. He let Richard's sins speak for him, and when they asked if he would wear the crown, he only said, "I will take what is mine, no more." But the crown had always been his shadow. Richard, returning from Ireland, found England hollow, empty of loyalty, full of doors that would not open, towns that would not light candles, and the cousin he had banished standing taller than the throne itself. The nobles called it destiny. Henry called it duty. But in his eyes burned something older than ambition, a quiet fury, aged in exile, sealed behind silence. A fury that does not shout, a fury that waits and watches and writes no letters, only endings. He stepped ashore like a man waking from a dream he did not remember, only to find his name erased from every banner. No trumpets, no procession. Just wind gnawing at the coastline and silence from the towns he once fed with proclamations. Richard had left a kingdom. He returned to a rumor. The roads were empty. The fields untended. The faces that met his gaze did not kneel. They looked past him, as if he were already gone. In the distance, a tower bell rang for someone else. He asked where his lords had gone. No one answered. He asked where his army waited. No one knew. He rode for London, but London no longer belonged to him. Its gates stayed closed. The Thames did not reflect his banners. The people leaned from windows but did not cheer. A child threw something, a stone, or an apple, or the future. At Flint Castle, the walls greeted him like tombstones. Cold stone, cold eyes. His captain spoke softly now, as though frightened of echo. When he sat in the great hall, the throne awaited, still, upright, shining in candlelight. He approached it like a man nearing confession. He lowered himself into it. It did not resist, but something had changed. The cushion sagged beneath him too deeply. The legs creaked, or perhaps there were none. He sat and he sank, slowly, gently, like a crown drowning in wet velvet. Henry arrived not with swords, but with silence. He entered the hall like a final breath. Behind him, the nobility reassembled, not around Richard, but around vacancy. The king stood to greet them. No one bowed. "Is this still my court?" he asked, voice thin as parchment. Henry did not answer. He didn't need to. The chamber was full of titles, but none belonged to Richard. They laid before him a parchment, ink still wet, words already decided. Abdication, surrender, survival. He stared at it. The script blurred. He did not cry. He laughed, a thin sound, as if memory itself were mocking him. "You promise I will live?" Henry nodded, but promises in castles are made of smoke. Richard dipped the quill. His hand shook. He signed. He gave away the thing he had never truly held, the crown, the seal, the throne. When he stood, no one stopped him, but no one followed. He turned once before leaving the chamber. The throne was empty, upright, waiting. But the longer he looked, the more it seemed to tilt, as if the room itself leaned away from him, as if the throne too had chosen a side. They moved him by night. No procession, no torches, just cloaks pulled tight and orders spoken without names. To Pontefract, not a prison, but a forgetting. The castle squatted against the moor like a thing ashamed to be seen. Its walls swallowed noise. Its gates opened like jaws. Inside, the air was thick with wet stone and the scent of boiled straw. His chamber had no fire. Only a bucket, a cot, and a door that never slammed. It closed like a secret. The guards did not speak. They did not bow. They did not look at him. He began to count their steps the way a monk might count beads. The rhythm was all that tethered him. At first, the food came in bowls too small to insult a king. Then the bowls grew smaller. Then the meat vanished. Then the broth thinned. No protest was made. No words were exchanged. Just less. Each day, less. Death arrived not with blade or noose, but with a spoonful missing. His fingers grew skeletal. His ring fell off without touch. He tied it to his wrist with a strip of cloth torn from the hem of his sleeve. It clinked when he raised his hand to his lips, trying to sip what they called soup. It tasted like memory, warm at first, then gone. The walls changed. They began to breathe. Cold bled from them like regret. He pressed his ear to the stone and heard things. Bells from churches that no longer stood, voices calling him Your Majesty in the wrong tongue. He smiled, then wept, then forgot why. One night an insect crawled across the floor, black, slow, deliberate. He watched it approach, a single shard of motion in a still world. When it reached his cot, it stopped, and in Anne's voice it said, You were never safe. He didn't scream. He thanked it. After that, they spoke often. The beetles, the spiders, the flies. They carried her voice, soft, steady, impossibly kind. Lie still, they whispered. The body remembers even what the mind wants to forget. He began to recite her letters aloud, though he had no parchment, just lines etched into his skull. He traced them on the wall with his fingernail until his skin split and left behind truth. His hair fell out in clumps. His teeth loosened. Hunger shaped him like a sculptor without patience. Once, he found a mouse beside his cot. It did not run. He did not kill it. They simply looked at each other, one king to another. There was no executioner, no trial, just the slow removal of days. The world narrowed until it was only breath and stone and the soft rustle of cloth too large for a shrinking man. On the last morning, the bowl did not come. The footsteps stopped. The door did not open. He curled beneath the window slit, where the light carved a thin blade into the floor. He laid his ring there as if it could reflect something. It did not, and in the silence, something inside him exhaled. Not a soul, not a prayer. Just the last word in a sentence no one heard. They dressed him in royal silks that no longer fit, folding the sleeves over bones like paper over twigs. His face had collapsed inward, cheeks hollowed, eyes sunken, lips drawn back in a frozen grimace that no one dared name, but they painted him nonetheless. Rouge on skin that no longer bled, powder on a brow that once bore a crown. The coffin, carved with lions and lilies, was too grand, too loud. The man inside had died in silence, and now they tried to bury that silence beneath ceremony. The procession moved through London like a shadow at noon, too bright, too slow. People gathered, not to mourn, but to confirm. They wanted to see, to witness, to measure the distance between myth and corpse. And there he was, the boy king, the mirror king, the broken frame carried on 6 shoulders. No one wept, but no one turned away. His face, half covered, was enough. They saw the truth, not the death, but the method. He had not been killed. He had been undone, one day at a time, by hands that had once bowed, by mouths that had once praised, by silence so complete it became execution. They said he died of heartbreak, of exile, of divine punishment. But no one believed it. Even the priests faltered over the words. They looked at the crowd and saw it. The understanding passed between glances, unsaid but shared. A man does not vanish to bone in 3 months without help. Henry watched from a window. He did not cry. He did not speak. but he kept the ring, the one they found by the window slit at Pontefract, wrapped in cloth, stained with blood not yet named. He kept it in a drawer, locked. Later, when the kingdom settled and the whispers cooled, they moved the body, quietly, reverently, to Westminster beside Anne. 2 coffins side by side, marble tombs etched with faces that no longer resembled their own. Lovers in death, though she had never seen the man he became. The tomb became a monument, but not to love, to warning. Children on tours were told of the gentle king, the poet king, the king who died too young. But the stone said more. It whispered, if you listened closely, as the light filtered through stained glass, never trust the smile that praises first. Never forget the silence that follows applause. And beneath the marble, a voice remained. Not loud, not royal, just the rasp of a man too long starved, still asking a question no one would answer.